Now, I'm going to try to give my introduction without using the microphone. Can you all hear me at the back? Yep. Okay, great. Welcome, first of all, Mr. Mayor, Madam Mayoress, Dame Julia, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the annual Fellows Lecture for St Cuthbert Society. In case you don't know, St Cuthbert Society is one of the constituent colleges of Durham University, and a group of members of the Senior Common Room have the honour of being elected as Fellows, and I have the particular honour of chairing the Fellows, and this lecture, of course, which is a public lecture, is given in the Fellows' name. So first of all, I need to thank the college for all of the support it has done in organising this. What I hope will be, I'm sure will be, a very memorable lecture. Our speaker today, as you know of course, is Lord Falconer. Law and politics seem to have run in Charles Falconer's family. He was born in 1951 in Edinburgh, where his father was a solicitor and his paternal grandfather was a former Lord Provost of Edinburgh. He was educated at the Edinburgh Academy. I'm going to have to resort to specs for my notes. And Trinity College, Glenarmond, before reading law at Queen's College in Cambridge. He then practiced as a barrister from Fountains Court Chambers in London, becoming a Queen's Counsel in 1991. In 1997, he was created a life peer as Baron Falconer of Thoroton in the county of Nottinghamshire, and joined the government as Solicitor General under Tony Blair. He was appointed Lord Chancellor and the first Secretary of State for Constitutional Affairs in 2003, and then the first Secretary of State for Justice in 2007, until Gordon Brown succeeded Tony Blair. The reforms overseen by him during his period of office as Lord Chancellor included the creation of a Supreme Court. And we might be hearing more about the Supreme Court later this year, I suspect. After the last general election, he became Shadow Justice Secretary under the then acting leader of the opposition, Harriet Harman, until he resigned on the 26th of June 2016, following the election of Jeremy Corbyn as leader of the Labour Party. In the Northeast, he's also well known to the Northeast. He chairs the Sage Gateshead Music Centre, the music performing centre there. Lord Falconer's subject this evening is the future of politics, which is certainly apposite, I'm sure you'll agree. It's now a quarter of a century since Francis Fukuyama famously announced the end of history. Clearly, he hadn't envisioned Brexit and the election of Donald Trump as the 45th President of the United States. A little earlier this evening, I looked online for reactions to this latest piece of revolutionary history, and one in particular took my eye. You'll be able to see that this is all it was, just a photograph of a T-shirt. I'm sure you can all see that it's a T-shirt. What you probably can't see is the slogan on it, which says, "Make America Great Britain Again." I don't think we could hear anything quite as revolutionary as that.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you for that very, very, very kind introduction. What an apposite T-shirt. I am genuinely delighted to be here in Durham today, essentially for two reasons. First of all, because my very good friend, Professor Elizabeth Archibald, has invited me here today. She is the principal of St Cuthbert's University. St Cuthbert's College, sorry, not St Cuthbert's University. I apologise for that. We were at university, a vastly inferior university, I should say, together, so it's great to be able to come and see her in Durham. That's the first reason I'm delighted to be here in Durham. The second reason I'm delighted to be here in Durham is because I've such fond memories of the kindness of the people of Durham. On my wall in my office there is a picture of a corner of Her Majesty's Prison, Durham, looking on to the beautiful city of Durham. The reason that picture is in my office is in 2000 I came to visit Durham. In the year 2000 I was the Minister of State at the Cabinet Office, and I was responsible for one of Labour's greatest successes, the Millennium Dome. I was the minister responsible for the Millennium Dome, and I managed it so well that I achieved something that no other minister, either in the Blair or the Brown government, achieved, namely on a particular day in September 2000, every single national newspaper called for my resignation on the same day. The solution thought up by the government to deal with me was to send me to Durham Prison to visit, and the people of Durham Prison could not have been nicer. Despite the fact that I went to Durham Prison and the people were incredibly nice in Durham Prison, the thunderous abuse of Charles Falconer continued. It went on for weeks and weeks and weeks. Eventually, after it had been going on for about 2 weeks, there was a headline in the Daily Star. The Daily Star, for those of you who don't know, is a newspaper, and indeed it wasn't a headline, it was a title on an editorial, and it said, "Lord Falconer should not resign." Salvation, I thought. It went on to say, "Lord Fatty," I was very fat in those days, "should be placed on the top of the dome, and they should both be burnt to a cinder." In the light of the continuing abuse of Lord Falconer, I was rung up a few days later by the then Prime Minister, Mr. Tony Blair, who said, "Have you thought about resigning?" And I said, "No." To which he replied, "Well, perhaps you'd like to give it some thought now." I said, "That's fine." I said, "Okay, I'm more than happy to resign," I said. He said, "I am in the Midlands today," he said. "I am going to Hull this evening to celebrate the 30th anniversary of John Prescott's time in Parliament in a very large Chinese restaurant in Hull, and I'm coming back to London tomorrow. So could you come and see me and resign tomorrow?" I said, "That's fine." Unbeknownst to both myself and the Prime Minister, spreading out all over England at the point that we were having this conversation were a large number of fuel protesters who were outraged by the increase in petrol prices. And some of these fuel protesters placed themselves on the Humber Bridge, which the Prime Minister had to get across in order to get to the Chinese restaurant where the 30th anniversary celebrations were going on. The presence of the fuel protesters, who could not be removed quickly enough by the police, was that the Prime Minister was forced not to go to the Chinese restaurant in Hull, but had to divert to London to deal with the crisis. The next morning, I walked from my office in the Cabinet Office to number 10 Downing Street and came into the Prime Minister's room, and he said, "What are you doing here?" I said, "I've come to resign, as agreed." He said, "Oh, I think it would be a very bad idea for the Prime Minister not to be able to get across the Humber Bridge and to lose his Dome Minister all within the space of 24 hours. Would you mind resigning tomorrow?" I said, "Not at all." I went away. During the course of that day, the Prime Minister, in ways I cannot now adequately recall, managed to show leadership and grip and made great progress in dealing with the fuel crisis. The next day, as agreed, I came back into his room and he again said, "What are you doing here?" I said, "As agreed, I've come to resign." He said, "For the first time in 3 weeks, you have been off the front pages of the newspaper. My advice to you is to go back to your room, pull the blinds down, lie flat on the floor, say nothing for a year, and you should be okay." So I took his advice and remained a minister. So that, all of this was just to say how pleased and grateful I am to the people of Durham for being so nice to me at the beginning of that 3-week period. It's very good to be talking to St Cuthbert's College. Universities are very often judged by the amount of research funding that they are able to generate. Another less used guide is how many Lord Chancellors the institution has produced. St Cuthbert's, I should tell you, has produced no Lord Chancellors. Durham University has produced no Lord Chancellors. The most recent sighting from a Lord Chancellor in the area, and it's not even from County Durham, was Richard Middleton of Northumberland in the year 1300. So for all of you from St Cuthbert's or Durham University, there is everything to play for in your future career. That is to try to break the record which has stood for 716 years. If you were to succeed, I should tell you Richard Middleton made very little mark as Lord Chancellor. Indeed, so little mark did he make that all that Wikipedia can offer about him is a general plea that someone might be willing to contribute a piece to Wikipedia about him. So I can't tell you anything about what Richard Middleton did. But Durham, far from being regarded as a platform to become Lord Chancellors, has been regarded as something of a reward for Lord Chancellors. The most powerful Lord Chancellor in history was Cardinal Wolsey. He became Lord Chancellor in 1515, and in 1523 he was made the Prince Bishop of Durham, and that was a prize indeed. Cardinal Wolsey harks back to an era where politics, as recorded in our history, was about rows between elites. He fell from grace because of his inability to procure a divorce for his patron and employer, Henry VIII. Now politics are very different. It may not seem that way because the reporting of politics is all too often about personalities. We focus on the competing characters of Clinton and Trump. And in reviewing my own personal experience in politics, it's impossible not to be focused on a daily basis on the personal rather than the bigger forces at play. For the individual politician, daily life should, however, be about the promotion of the ideals for which you stand and avoiding the brickbats of those with competing ideals. Lose sight of those competing ideals and it becomes an inauthentic game which appears both irrelevant and offensive to the public. Those who compete for national leadership should not simply fight for personal position. But it can be so difficult to focus on the clash of ideas and ideals when the focus is on the stuff of the 24-hour news cycle. However, the political events of the last year reveal that the questions in the electorate's mind which determine the results of elections have completely changed, and right throughout the developed world. I speak with the experience of the United Kingdom in mind, but it is plain that the political events in the United Kingdom over the last year connect strongly with the election of Trump earlier this week, with the rise of the far right in Germany and France, the rise of anti-politics parties in Italy, and the destruction of all of the traditional political parties in Greece. In this lecture, I will focus on the United Kingdom. In 1997, when I became involved in frontline politics, but the dividing line between the Tories and the Labour Party was primarily who could best run the economy. There was no significant ideological divide between the two parties as to what the basic tenets of that economy should be. An open, trading, internationalist nation running a mixed economy with strength in particular areas such as financial services, which brought increasing tax revenues, with as high quality public services as taxes set at a politically acceptable level would allow. Labour won in 1997 because we had a leader trusted to run the economy better than John Major, and who chimed in much more closely with the mood and the aspirations of the country. But the differences that determined that Tony Blair won were competence judgments, not judgments about the fundamental direction of our country. The dividing issues in the immediate aftermath of 1997 were much more about the pace of social change and the extent to which the state should intervene to promote equality and opportunity. The minimum wage, levels of expenditure on the health service, the funding of universities, human rights, civil partnerships. These were the issues which animated politics after 1997. The EU was unpopular, it divided the Tory party, there was a significant issue about the euro, the decision not to join the euro was made on economic, not political grounds. It would be impossible for the UK economy to thrive where there was insufficient integration between the economies of the UK and the rest of the EU. But it was not seriously argued that we should leave the European Union. But in the 19 years between 1997 and now, and indeed some of these trends had already been apparent before 1997, three significant things were happening in our country. First, our heavy industry, mining and manufacturing sectors were significantly declining and transforming communities which had been dependent on those sectors for jobs and for communities for generations. Here in the northeast of England, there is no place that has been worse affected by that change in the whole of the United Kingdom. This had been happening for some time before 1997. The cause of it was not our membership of the European Union. It was, however, the product of an open trading world where the absence of protectionism meant that the United Kingdom, with its higher wage costs, could not compete with Polish coal or Chinese steel. There was huge dislocation at a social level as a result. The miners' strikes of the 70s and the miners' strike in the middle of the 1980s represented the fight of some of those communities against their fate. But that battle did not ultimately engender wider support within the country. Genuine sympathy for their fate, disgust at the heartless way the government executed these measures did not translate into a rejection by a majority of our country of the direction of economic policy. This change in the nature of our economy, described in the destruction of these economic communities, has had a profound and long-term effect on the nature of people's sense of self in these communities. As John Lancaster said in July 2016 in a piece after Brexit, quote, "To be born in many places in Britain is to suffer an irreversible, lifelong defeat, a truncation of opportunity, of education, of access to power, of life expectancy." The places Lancaster refers to are the places where in previous generations people were equipped for reasonably well-paid manual labour, semi and skilled work. Children left school and went to work in the same industries that had employed their parents. The academically able kids escaped into the middle class. All that has now gone, the jobs and the opportunity, and the vista instead is a landscape where there's often work. There are pockets of unemployment in the United Kingdom, but in general there is no shortage of jobs, and the labour force participation rate is the highest it's ever been, a full 15 points higher than the US, but it's unsatisfying, 0 hours contracts, insecure and low paid. The new work doesn't do what the old work did. It doesn't offer a sense of identity or community or self-worth. Somebody can take away the things whenever they feel like it. Since long before 1997, there's been the pursuit of policy which has involved in large measure an abandonment of the white working class, sometimes mitigated by financial transfers from government, such as in-work benefits, but no resistance of the direction of travel. The second event that has happened since 1997 is the stagnation in people's standard of living since the Great Recession started in 2007, 9 years ago. Since the recession started, there has been no increase in the median incomes of people of working age in this country. Unemployment has not spiked, but stagnation has. And the third event is the advent of immigration from the European Union. There has always been some immigration from the European Union. It increased very substantially after the accession of the Eastern European countries began in 2004. There are now 2.2 million non-UK born people in the UK labour force with accompanying dependents. These three events were increasingly reflected in the political response of the UK electorate. First, the growth of UKIP, which became the third most popular party in the UK by 2015. Second, the growth of Scottish nationalism. There could be no doubt for those who campaigned for the Union during the independence referendum in Scotland in 2014 that the traditional Labour voter was the most enthusiastic for independence, because independence represented an escape from the stagnation and precariousness of the economy, which the politicians, as far as the people of Scotland were concerned, appeared to have deliberately accepted for the electorate. The EU, ironically, was a strong part of the narrative offered by the SNP. We can survive alone, but within the EU, they said. And independence nearly prevailed. The extent of the rejection of the old economic consensus in Scotland was demonstrated by the almost clean sweep of the SNP in the 2015 general election. The Scots had had enough of an economic policy which appeared to leave the working person behind. And it went much deeper than the traditional working class. It stretched much higher up the skill chain in the employment market than previously, because stagnation was not restricted to the working class. All the comparisons economically pointed to rejection for very many people of the way the economy was working for them, whether it be how well off people had been previously, or how well off they were likely to be compared with their parents, or how well off they appeared to be compared to the people who caused the crisis, namely the bankers. And then the third and most significant political event, the vote to leave the European Union on the 23rd of June 2016. It was the product of the three trends I've identified earlier: the disappointing nature of work for many, economic stagnation for many, and the belief that increased immigration reduced people's economic prospects and increased pressure on public services. The mainstream politicians, with some exceptions, were in favour of staying. The body politic could not find a serious politician who was in favour of leave to lead the country after the referendum. So we have a Remainer, a lukewarm one, but nevertheless a Remainer as our leader, having accepted the resignation of the previous PM because he was a Remainer who failed to convince the country. Because the current Prime Minister, Mrs. Theresa May, did not really try to convince the country to stay, she is acceptable. To be fair to her, there is a widespread sense that she is the most appropriate person to lead the country in the light of her demonstrated political capability and her apparent reliability over 6 years at the Home Office. It is apparent that she is well aware of the fact that she may at any moment become unacceptable to the Brexit majority in the country, and is being very careful to demonstrate her commitment to deliver on the result of the referendum. She is right to make clear her commitment to deliver on leaving the European Union. The public were told the referendum would decide whether we remained or left. They, the public, made a clear decision, not a landslide, but a majority of over 1 million. No doubts about it. So the politicians must act as we said that we would. But Mrs. May is wrong to believe that the vote to leave carried with it the permission for more fundamental changes in our law, or could justify a failure on her part to act in accordance with the Constitution. Her striking refusal to defend the 3 judges who decided that the individual rights which citizens obtain from being in the EU could not be removed by an exercise of the royal prerogative, and that an act of Parliament was required, reflected that she did not want to be seen to support any person who might wrongly be described as an elite seeking to frustrate Brexit. It is because that appeared to be her view of the judges that the standing and therefore the independence of the judiciary was damaged. And then the damage was compounded by the refusal of the Lord Chancellor to defend the 3 judges at all, even though the Lord Chancellor has a statutory duty to uphold judicial independence, which is not subject to the rules of collective responsibility. Because the Lord Chancellor has this grave constitutional responsibility, before she appointed the Lord Chancellor, the Prime Minister had by statute to satisfy herself that the person appointed was qualified by experience to defend the judges. It was apparent that Liz Truss was not so qualified, but she got appointed. The demonstration of her inability to do the most significant part of her job could not have been starker in the last week. Until she is replaced, the judges will lack a constitutional protector within the government. If they have such a protector, then the press can criticise them as much as they like. The judges know that they are safe. The silence of the Lord Chancellor in defending the 3 judges, and instead offering late formulaic support for the concept of an independent judiciary, sends the message to the judges that the government will not seek to protect them from pressure to decide cases in a particular way. Nobody suggests the Lord Chancellor should seek to muzzle the press. She can't and she shouldn't. What she should have done is to say the judges decided the case in accordance with their duty. The press are wrong to attack them for it, and she will use the whole power of her office to defend the judge's ability to decide cases in accordance with the law, not in accordance with the campaigns of 3 newspaper proprietors. The rule of law depends on it. In the light of the vote to leave the European Union, what is politics about now in the United Kingdom? That is easy to answer at an immediate level. It is about the terms upon which we exit the European Union and the terms upon which we establish relationships with the rest of the world, including the European Union, in the light of our exit. First, we must accept the verdict of the referendum. There should be no commitment to a second referendum at some later stage in the process. The people have decided, and now it is the duty of the politicians to do their best to deliver. I see no sign that the public are remorseful about the decision, rather the reverse. The failure of the worst economic fears to materialise so far gives confidence that the storm that may follow leaving the European Union can be weathered. If the public were at some time to change their mind, that would no doubt become apparent. But our duty is now, as politicians, to deliver. There are a whole variety of Brexits we could aim for. At one extreme is that favoured by the likes of Liam Fox. We could become a low-tax offshore haven with no specific trade deal with the European Union, but instead we should rely on standard trading terms with the European Union determined by the World Trade Organization. This would allow us, Liam Fox argues, to do deals with other countries, and we would thrive as a country because of our entrepreneurial spirit. Definitely not. Tariffs would be imposed on goods passing between the EU and the UK. Much of our successful manufacturing industry is based upon manufacturing parts for bigger items. The UK, for instance, has the second biggest aerospace industry in the world. The most complicated bit of a plane is the wing. The world's biggest passenger aircraft wing belongs to the Airbus 380, which is made in Wales and sent to France. They're so big that they travel from the Dee estuary in North Wales to Pauillac on the Gironde estuary on a specially built roll-on, roll-off ship. If we follow Liam Fox's advice, that's the end of the manufacture of those wings. For those of us who didn't want to leave the EU, at the other end of the spectrum, and those who say we should are those who say we should accept free movement of labour and therefore impose no restrictions on immigration from the EU. That, they argue, would allow us to stay in the single market, and although we would be formally not a member of the European Union, we would suffer no economic detriment. True, we would have to pay into the EU budget and accept the rules of the single market, including rulings of the Court of the European Union, without having a say on those rules, but that would be a small price to pay to stay in the single market. For those of us who didn't want to leave the EU, that would, at one level, be the least bad result. But in my view, it would not be loyally giving effect to the referendum. Without some identifiable degree of control over immigration from the EU, restrictions on free movement of labour, Brexit would only be Brexit in name and not in substance. I think the right place for the United Kingdom to seek to get to in the negotiations has the following elements. First, there has to be some restrictions on immigration into the UK. In determining where to place the restrictions, only people with a job or non-skilled only to be restricted, for example, regard needs to be had to two particular factors. Our economy has grown over the last 30 years, in part because of immigration, with immigrants both as employees and spenders. And second, the more restrictions on immigration from the EU, the harder the deals the EU will strike on other matters. So first, there needs to be some restrictions on immigration. Second, we should seek tariff-free access for goods to preserve those manufacturing chains I referred to, and so that our car industry can trade effectively with the EU. This is possible and goes against no grains within the EU. Canada and the EU have just negotiated such a deal, which has been ratified by the whole of the EU. Third, on services, sector-by-sector deals on the access of our services to the EU market, including on financial services, should be negotiated. It may well be that because we are imposing restrictions on immigration, we will not be able to stay as a member or a full participant, like Norway, in the single market, though we should not give up on this. Whether we stay or not, our aim should be get as free access to the services market as possible, consistent with the restrictions on immigration we impose. In relation to financial services, we have so many advantages in the London market. We are the world leader now with the best infrastructure, the best law, the best language, the best time zone, that some regulatory disadvantage that is bound to flow from the deal that we do may well not damage the strength of our financial services industry in London that much. And finally, in relation to the elements of the deal we should do with the European Union, in relation to non-economic relationships, justice, counter-terrorism, the environment, we should try to emulate the current arrangements as much as possible. It is hugely to the advantage of the world and to the UK that we fight climate change, we fight terrorism, and we fight crime together with Europe rather than separately. The negotiation of these elements, particularly the tariff-free trade deal and the service arrangements, are likely to take more than 2 years, which is the length of time before the notice which brings our membership of the EU to an end expires. The PM said at her party conference that she would serve the notice by the end of March 2017, and she has subsequently said that the court case will not derail that timetable. Therefore, interim arrangements will need to be in place to avoid the United Kingdom falling off a cliff and suddenly being faced with chaos, uncertainty, and trade barriers that would arise from there being no agreement. It is in the interests of both the remaining 27 and the United Kingdom for there to be orderly disengagement. The most sensible interim position that we should contend for is that we continue within the single market for a time-limited period after the expiry of the notice to allow the negotiations that I've referred to be concluded. But the future of United Kingdom politics is about much more than the specific arrangements to be negotiated with the European Union. It is also about the fundamental choices to be made about the country we want to live in. For me, those choices involve still striving for an internationalist, open country where the progressive values which have characterised the last 50 years endure. For me, giving effect to the result of the referendum means above all else providing for those communities which we as a country abandoned over the last 40 years, and for those people, particularly those in working poverty, who now side with the abandoned communities in demanding that the economic direction change, and we as a country do not ignore them. And it's about more than just ensuring those people have income growth, it's about opportunity and personal fulfillment. As important as the precise terms of the deal we do with the European Union is a commitment to an effective programme of regeneration in the abandoned communities, the adoption by the government of a policy of supporting and promoting industrial growth, and the genuine removal of barriers to social mobility in the UK. President-elect Trump has tapped into similar economic abandonment amongst the white working class population in the USA, and they have a legitimate grievance. But he's done it with a campaign of racism, misogyny, and contempt for progressive values. To recognise the factors which led to Brexit does not compel us as a country to a Farage-Trump conclusion. Brexit and Trump are terrible setbacks. In dealing with them, we must accept and respond to the travail of the people who supported these options, and in the UK we must leave the EU. But I will not abandon the ideals which have animated our politics for a generation. These progressive values of tolerance, fairness, human rights, equality, and the rule of law endure beyond electoral defeat. Others have said it better than I. In 1980, a progressive politician defeated in the United States on the campaign trail after the electoral defeat ended his failed campaign with these words: "To all those who are idle in the cities and industries of America, let us provide new hope for the dignity of useful work. Democrats have always believed that a basic civil right is their right to earn their own way. The party of the people must always be the party of full employment. To all those who doubt the future of our economy, let us provide new hope for the re-industrialization of America. And let our vision reach beyond the next election or the next year to a new generation of prosperity. If we could rebuild Germany and Japan after World War II, then surely we can re-industrialise our own nation and revive our own inner cities. And someday, long after this convention, long after the signs come down and the crowd stop cheering and the band stop playing, may it be said of our campaign that we kept the faith. May it be said that we found our faith again. And may it be said of us, both in the dark passages and in bright days, in the words of Tennyson, that my brothers quoted and loved, and that have special meaning for me now. I am part of all that I have met, though much is taken, much abides. That which we are, one equal temper of heroic hearts, strong in will to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield. For me, a few hours ago, this campaign came to an end. For all those whose cares have been our concern, the work goes on, the cause endures, the hope still lives, and the dream shall never die. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much for a very clear notion of what we have to face us and what choices we might have to make in the future. Lord Falconer is happy to answer questions. I'm sure there'll be many from the audience. Please.
You talked about the strategy in approaching Brexit, but didn't say very much at all about the people who were going to conduct that. Now, during the Blair years, we had the situation where the Home Civil Service, to a large extent, was marginalised in favour of specialist advisors. Whether that sort of people can make a contribution now seems much in doubt, because the word seems to be that the Home Civil Service is now being told to put together the appropriate strategy. Are we equipped for what's to come forward, given the fact that that's the approach, and given the ministers, the triumvirate of ministers in the Tory party? Do we have the people to tackle a situation where it's one country against 26?
27. I think that's a very, very good question. I think you've got to look at who's going to conduct this negotiation at two levels. First of all, the politicians. I think it is hard to imagine a worse trio to do it than Boris Johnson, David Davis and Liam Fox, and each one of them has their own peculiar awfulnesses. If you want to do a successful negotiation, I think not being vain, being able to show consistency and get into the detail. Boris Johnson does not look like the person to do that. You've got to efface your own character and think only of the national interest. There's no vainer politician than David Davis, and you've got to be willing to be non-ideological and try to get the best deal you can practically. Liam Fox is ideologically in favour of a low-tax offshore island, Britain, without any deal with the European Union. So we are in a disastrous position in relation to the three particular politicians tasked with the task of negotiating our way out of the European Union. And it really, really matters, because the negotiations that are required are quite delicate. The European Union, from my experience of talking to people in Europe since the vote, are sad we've done it, but are keen to do a sensible deal with us. They are horrified by watching, for example, Amber Rudd say at the Tory party conference, we want people to publish lists of how many foreigners are working for them, which sends a very xenophobic message. They're horrified by David Davis saying in the House of Commons, if the European governments want to punish us with a hard Brexit, we'll start to try to encourage their populations to give them something of their own medicine. Now, that is not trying to get the best deal, it is making the position very, very bad. So the politicians are terrible. I think, as it happens, the best of the four is Theresa May. I think she is more sensible than the other three, and I hope that she will be the person making most of the decisions and setting the tone. But I'm not optimistic about her. In relation to the civil service, it's absolutely obvious that they haven't got trade negotiators, because the effect of joining the European Union is that all trade negotiations have to be conducted by the European Union. So we don't have any. They are at the moment creating the Department for Exiting the European Union, which is based in the Cabinet Office, the place where I was when I walked through to Downing Street to resign all those years ago. It's headed up by a man called Ollie Robbins, who used to be the principal private secretary to various prime ministers. He's putting together a team to do it. He is the key civil servant. As far as I can see, he has absolutely no experience, although he's a very well-meaning chap, of doing the sort of thing he's about to embark on. So, spot on for raising it.
Referring to Tony Blair,
Yeah.
some of us here, the older ones, will remember him as a boy in Durham. And in fact, I cuffed him across the ear on one occasion, but clearly I didn't hit him hard enough. But you saw him in a variety of guises. You think, A, he should come back, and B, will he come back? Because I think, personally, he still has something to offer.
Well, I was a friend and remain a very close friend of Tony Blair's. I think that he achieved a huge amount for the country. I don't think it is a good idea for politicians who've been Prime Minister to try to come back in any way. I think from time to time it is wholly appropriate for them to express views about politics. But once you've been Prime Minister, and he was Prime Minister for 10 years, I think the appropriate course is to let others pick up the baton after he has gone. And I think the best position for him is to intervene on issues as a elder statesman, but to come back into active politics, I'm sure, is not something that he would actively seek, and I don't think it would be appropriate.
He seems a damn sight better than some who are in that.
I wouldn't disagree with that.
Please.
What do you think the Labour Party has to do to regain the trust of the working class?
I think that what the Labour Party has to do to regain the trust of the working class is to address the three issues that I identified in my speech. First of all, the destruction of economic communities. Secondly, the stagnation of wages. And thirdly, immigration coming in from the European Union. And if we as a party have a convincing answer to those three issues, then we will revive in our heartland. We are haunted as a party, in my view, quite rightly, by what happened to Labour in Scotland in 2015. And if we don't provide answers to those three issues, I fear for what may happen to us.
Is anyone on this side? Are there any questions here? Yes, please.
Could I refer to tolerance that you
Yeah.
talked about politics, and you mentioned religious tolerance,
Yeah.
which I think is a country we're pretty proud of in our politics. I'm a little concerned about possible strains of anti-Semitism within the Labour Party, and I just wondered if you think that's anecdotal or whether you think it is a problem.
I think it is a problem, and I think for the Labour Party to carry with it the taint of it being possibly anti-Semitic is absolutely shameful and terrible. I do not believe that Jeremy Corbyn is anti-Semitic at all, and indeed from my personal experience of him, he is not anti-Semitic. But you need, within a party like the Labour Party, where there are very strongly held views about what to do in the Middle East, to be absolutely clear, particularly if you have criticisms of the Israeli government, you've got to be absolutely clear that any form of anti-Semitism should be crushed, and anybody who is guilty of it has to be expelled, and expelled immediately from the Labour Party. I say it's important to make that clear because only if you are clear about your anti-Semitic stance is it possible to be critical of what the Israeli government has done without appearing to subscribe to anti-Semitism. So I am really concerned about it. I think it is terrible for the Labour Party because one of the things that the Labour Party stands for almost above anything else is anti-discrimination.
Thank you.
How accurate was the perception that the EU was inefficient and democratic? How did Parliament as a whole see that? Were they genuine, those criticisms, or were they not?
My experience of dealing with the European Union it's inefficient. It is undemocratic in the sense that when you go to Brussels and deal with the European Commission, they are disconnected, insensitive to the individual problems in individual places, patronising, self-important. I mean, why did the European Union become so unpopular? Because it is not. I mean, if it was genuinely democratic, people would have, achieved change more easy. I mean, having made all those criticisms, I make it clear I wanted to stay in the European Union, but the European Union definitely had to change, and it was, as an institution, almost its own worst enemy. So perception, broadly accurate.
Yep.
Was it a mistake for the Labour Party not to challenge the assumptions that were made about immigration years and years ago, rather than to accept the idea that we need controls on immigration?
Well, I'm not sure what you mean by the assumption. There are 2.2 million European Union born citizens in the UK at the moment. The worry that animates Brexit for very many people is that if you have a pool, particularly of Eastern European workers who will work at minimum wage levels or nearby, that will have the effect both of stagnating wages for the indigenous population and put pressure on public services. In some places and in some areas, that has happened. However, overall, the economy has been boosted by immigration. So looked at as an overall economic issue, immigration is good for the country. But that raises the very question about the European Union. When I was campaigning in the European Union referendum, in London, every question at every meeting was how could anybody think that we would want to leave the European Union? Because London is absolutely benefiting from being in the European Union, and in particular from immigration. The moment you're outside the M25, the vast majority of people were saying, what's the European Union ever done for me? It's kept wages stagnating, and it's putting pressure, not everywhere, and indeed mostly not anywhere, but in some places, putting pressure on public services. So when you say to me, were we wrong to not challenge the assumptions, we said repeatedly that immigration brings benefits to the country as a whole, but we were not, even insofar as we were not understanding why people were worried about immigration, then maybe we failed properly to pick up the mood. But I don't think that's what you're asking. I think you were saying that we should have been saying to everybody, stop worrying about immigration. How's it affecting you?
Question at the back.
I think that that's right, that there is something to say and respond to the concerns and anxieties that people have about immigration. I should know I am an immigrant. But one of the things that
We
comes
couldn't
out
tell
when
from your
I raise my voice to people,
Yeah.
it's that some immigrants are more of a concern than others.
Yeah.
And there's some communities that are more anxious about immigration than others. You talk about being outside the M25. Down the road in Redcar, that borough has got the smallest immigration, smallest foreign-born population in Britain. There's more foreign-born folks in the Shetland Islands and in Northern Ireland than in Redcar and in Cleveland. Yet there was very sincere and deep anxiety about immigration. You look across the United States, a lot of people concerned about immigration voting for Donald Trump, the son of a Scottish immigrant to Britain, married to a European citizen, his children, the children of immigrants. I think that there is a concern about immigration. I think immigration is a proxy for other concerns. It's a bogeyman of other things that are going on.
Well, I mean, you say that. The place where there is the greatest immigration in this country is London, and that was the most strongly in favour of staying in the European Union. Why is Redcar, where there is very little immigration, opposed? Because, understandably, it is an economically very precarious place which has suffered terrible economic blows in the removal of the steel works there. What is a community like Redcar going to think where it's lost its steelworks and it can see cheap labour, cheaper labour than Redcar offers, available and willing to come over? So of course they're going to be worried about it. And are they wrong economically to think that the communities that will be most affected by it will be the economically precarious ones, not the prosperous ones like London? You want to come back on?
So I think that's a failure of government. It's not about immigration. I think government has to take responsibility.
Right. Well, you say it's a failure of government. If you are
to continue to invest in the north.
Yeah. No, I agree with that. I agree with that. And the moment we have this conversation, what it shows is the failure of governments, Labour and Tory alike, was not to realise that the differential benefits of the European Union, so focused on London and so unfocused on the rest of the country, meant that England outside London didn't want to stay in the European Union, and there are more people outside London than inside London.
Please, do you have a question?
But you could argue that the Labour Party, in its time, did quite a lot in the building of regional development agencies, an attempt to invest. At least they got government offices in the main places. It was the Tory Party, 2010, that removed the regional development agencies, removed the government offices, and I think since then there's been very little concern in the last 6 years about the investment in those communities which in the end voted so profoundly. We didn't, the Brexit loss was not lost in the cities. Only, I think, Birmingham voted against. Newcastle was in, Liverpool was in, all sorts of places that might not have been all that much in favour of the European Union. We lost, the Brexit vote was lost in the regions, just as you identify, where the communities were poorest and least investment had been made. What hope have you got that investment is now going to be made in those places when it was in fact the Tories that removed quite a lot of what the Labour Party, not enough, but had tried to do?
I mean, I completely agree with that, and I agree with the implication of what you are saying, which is that if it had been a continuum from 1997 until 2016 of a government earnestly pouring as much money as it could in to those abandoned communities, the white working class who voted for Brexit would not have thought, this is the only way to get my sense of self, sense of worth, and my wages going up again, back. So I completely agree with the analysis. What hope, and I mean, just add to that, the adoption of austerity in 2010 and the changing of the local government formula so that it tended to favour the rich southern areas to the detriment of the poorer areas in the country, and the changing of the formula in relation to the funding of education, all of those things made the abandoned communities feel more abandoned. What hope does one have that the Tories will change that? Well, Mrs May made her speech when she came to Downing Street. Some of you may remember a Prime Minister called Mrs Thatcher, who became Prime Minister and then quoted from the St Francis of Assisi on the day that she became Prime Minister in number 10 Downing Street. And then if you go anywhere in the northeast of England and mention Mrs Thatcher, all they remember is the brutal closing of a whole range of industries and communities and the destruction of places like Newcastle and many other places in the northeast. So compare and contrast Mrs Thatcher with Mrs May, one perhaps should not be too optimistic.
I'm conscious that it's now after 8:15. I'm going to claim Chairman's privilege and ask one final question, I think. Yesterday I saw a report that I've not seen anywhere else, it was in the Independent, to the effect that the European Parliament may be going to propose that following Brexit, individual members, individual citizens of the UK might be able to retain their EU citizenship. What do you think as a constitutional lawyer about that? Is that...
Well, I mean, it's up to the European Union who can become citizens. You know, I mean, you can, countries all over the world will allow people to become citizens of their country, even though they've got no connection, because they think it does them some good.
So,
they can do that if they like. I don't think it's going to make much difference, and I think it will become, it'll feel like adding salt to the wound, but I don't think it's very significant.
well, apparently it would allow us at least to move around Europe freely, as we do at the moment.
Well, they don't need to make us citizens to do that. They need to say we can do it.
Thanks very much for a most entertaining and informative lecture. I'm going to call on Elizabeth Archibald, Principal of St Cuthbert Society, to issue a vote of thanks.
I'm going to use the principal's privilege to ask one last question, because we've been talking about the fairly short-term future in many respects. I think a number of the young people here, and certainly young people I've been talking to recently, are very disillusioned with politics, and of course much of the two big votes you've been discussing, the two recent dramas in England and America, have been to do with distrust of politicians. So what do you have to say to young people about a future in politics?
This must be the moment to be in politics. And I say that not in remotely ironically, because maybe unlike the last 20 or 30 years, such big issues are in play now. And there is the detailed issues about how we get out of Europe and what the precise terms of that will be. But much, much more importantly is, are we going to go into the dystopian Trump world in which tolerance, human rights, dignity, the rule of law get lost simply on the basis of a sectional interest? Or are we going to stand for the progressive values that we've stood for as a country for so long? And that is why politics is so important at the moment. And the implication of Elizabeth's question is right. The current generation of politics are hopelessly compromised in the eyes of the public, and probably rightly so, not for corruption, but because we failed to see what was coming down the track, and the consequence was the country left the European Union, and in America, Trump became the president of the United States of America. So it is so conspicuously a time for a new generation, because the current generation of politicians doesn't have the leverage with the public anymore to stand up for the things that really matter. And it has to be a new generation. So my strong, strong, strong urge, plea and advice is, please go into politics and please stand for the things that are so seriously and appallingly at risk.
Even got to my facts yet, so now we have to do this all over again. It must be about 45 years since Charlie and Dame Julia Cleveland and I were all students, and in those happy, innocent days we spent a lot of time sitting on the floor in each other's rooms with large teapots and very good cakes and lots of mugs drinking tea. That was the innocent form of entertainment in those days. I don't think that we all imagined that Charlie was going to go into politics. He was destined for a career in law. I think we're very, very glad that he did go into politics, and we're extremely glad that he's come to talk to us today, even though he committed the cardinal sin of calling Cuthbert a college. But we'll forgive him. He's a Cambridge man. He doesn't realise how important this is. He'll learn. I hope he'll come back and talk to us again. I should say that I do have some doubts about his ability to prophesy the future, because I happened to be at a party with him in Julia Cleverton's house the day after the referendum, and I said to him, I hope you remember this, Charlie, who's the next Tory leader going to be? And he said, absolutely no question, Boris. And I said, no, not Theresa May? Absolutely out of the question. So, in spite of that, we are hugely grateful for the insights he's given us into the political process, for the very, very clear summary of the last 20 years or so, and its discontents and mistakes. And I do echo his call to all the young people present. This is your moment. You can clean up the mess. You can make a difference. So with his advice ringing in your ears, I hope some of you will do that. But let's thank him one more time for a really inspiring evening.